Hello everyone, welcome to the video lecture series on Chemical Engineering Thermodynamics 1. Myself, Jaimin Pandya, Assistant Professor in Chemical Engineering Department of LJIET Institute of Engineering and Technology. In this video lecture, we'll start a new chapter which is a heat effect. So in this lecture, we'll talk about sensible heat and specific heat, then discuss difference between sensible heat and specific heat, and then talk about types of heat capacity such as a constant volume heat capacity and constant pressure heat capacity. Then we'll talk about the latent heat and their types, various types of latent heat such as a latent heat of vaporization, latent heat of sublimation, and latent heat of fusion. So we'll talk about the various types of latent heat in this lecture and then discuss difference between sensible heat and latent heat. Then we'll talk about the endothermic reaction and exothermic reaction. And then finally we discuss difference between endothermic reaction and exothermic reaction. So let's start with sensible heat. Sensible heat is the amount of thermal energy that is required to rise an object temperature. To understand this, let's consider this example. In this example, there is a water in beaker, and if we applying heat to this water, then this water will be heat up, and heat required to rise temperature for this water, then that type of heat requirement is known as a sensible heat. So heat required to rise temperature of any object, then that type of heat requirement is known as a sensible heat. Sensible heat that can be given by Q is equal to M into C into delta T, where Q is a heat, M is a mass, C which means heat capacity, and delta T which means change in temperature. Change in temperature that can be given by T2 minus T1, where T2 is a final temperature and T1 which is a initial temperature. Now let's talk about specific heat. Specific heat is the amount of thermal energy that is required to rise unit mass of object temperature. So heat required to rise temperature of unit mass substance or unit mass of system, then that type of heat requirement is known as a specific heat. So what is difference between sensible heat and specific heat? In sensible heat, there is no fixed amount of mass, where in specific heat, there is a fixed amount of mass, or we can say that specific amount of mass. So in specific heat, we are going to fix amount of mass of particular substance or object in which we are going to apply heat, and heat required to rise temperature of that fixed amount of mass or specific amount of mass, then that type of heat requirement is known as a specific heat. So this is a basic difference between sensible heat and specific heat. Now let's talk about various types of heat capacity, such as a constant volume heat capacity and constant pressure heat capacity. So let's talk about first constant volume heat capacity, that can be given by Q is equal to M into Cv into delta T, where Q is the heat, M is the mass, Cv is the constant volume heat capacity, and delta T is a change in temperature. If we apply heat to constant volume process and measure heat capacity for that particular system, then that type of heat capacity is known as a constant volume heat capacity. So now let's talk about constant pressure heat capacity, that can be given by Q is equal to M into Cp into delta T, where Q is a heat, M is a mass, Cp is a constant pressure heat capacity, and delta T is a change in temperature. If we apply heat to constant pressure process and measure heat capacity for particular system, then that type of heat capacity is known as a constant pressure heat capacity, and that denoted by Cp. Constant pressure heat capacity is always greater than constant volume heat capacity. So this is all about the constant volume heat capacity and constant pressure heat capacity. Now let's talk about latent heat. Latent heat, which means heat required to change the phase of any substance, then that type of heat requirement is known as a latent heat. To understand this, let's consider this example. In this example, there is a solid material and if we are applying heat to this solid material and this solid material is converted into the liquid, then heat required to transfer or change the phase of this solid material into the liquid material, then that type of heat requirement is known as the latent heat. In other words, can say that latent heat is defined as the heat or energy that is absorbed or released during the phase change of the substance. So this is about the latent heat. There are mainly three types of latent heat, such as latent heat of fusion, latent heat of vaporization, and latent heat of sublimation. To understand this, let's consider this example. In this example, there is a ice cube. If we apply heat to this ice cube, then this ice cube will be melted and converted into the water. So heat required to convert solid into the liquid, then that type of heat requirement is known as a latent heat of fusion. If we apply further heat to this liquid and this liquid is converted into the vapor, then heat required to convert liquid into the vapor, then that type of heat requirement is known as a latent heat of vaporization. So this is all about the latent heat. Now let's talk about difference between latent heat and sensible heat. Sensible heat, which means heat required to rise temperature of thermodynamic system, then that type of heat requirement is known as a sensible heat, where heat required to change the phase of any thermodynamic system is known as a latent heat. So there is basic difference between sensible heat and latent heat. In sensible heat, there is a change in temperature, but there is no change in phase, where in latent heat, there is change in phase, but there is no change in temperature. So latent heat occurs at fixed temperature. So this is a basic difference between latent heat and sensible heat. Now let's talk about exothermic reaction. Exothermic reaction, which means reaction or process that release heat or energy from system to the surrounding in a form of heat or light. In exothermic reaction, energy is released because the total energy of product is less than total energy of reactant. To understand this, let's consider this example. In this example, there is a phosphorus. If we are contact this phosphorus with oxygen and phosphorus react with oxygen, then it makes phosphorus pentoxide and release heat. So this type of reaction which release heat is known as the exothermic reaction. Exothermic reaction is release heat from system to the surrounding, or can say that exothermic reaction release heat from reaction to the surrounding. Now let's talk about endothermic reaction. Endothermic reaction are a chemical reaction in which the reactant absorbs heat energy from the surrounding to form product. To understand this, let's consider this example. In this example, there is a water. Now if we are going to apply heat to this water, then it's converted into the vapor. So this type of reaction in which heat is required for the reaction from the surrounding, then that type of reaction is known as the endothermic reaction. Now let's talk about the basic difference between endothermic reaction and exothermic reaction. Endothermic reaction are a chemical reaction that absorb heat energy from the surrounding, where exothermic reaction are a chemical reaction that release heat energy to the surrounding. In endothermic reaction, temperature decrease with progression of the reaction, where in exothermic reaction, temperature increase with progression of the reaction. In endothermic reaction, enthalpy of reactant is lower than product, where in exothermic reaction, enthalpy of reactant is higher than of product. In endothermic reaction, change in enthalpy is a positive value, where in exothermic reaction, change in enthalpy is a negative value. In endothermic reaction, energy should be given to the system, where in exothermic reaction, energy is released from the system. So this is a basic difference between endothermic reaction and exothermic reaction. So this is all about difference between endothermic reaction and exothermic reaction. So in this lecture, talk about sensible heat and specific heat, heat required to change the temperature of any object, then that type of heat is known as a sensible heat. Then talk about specific heat, heat required to change the temperature of unit mass of system, then it's known as a specific heat. So this is the basic difference between sensible heat and specific heat. In sensible heat there is no fixed amount of mass, where in specific heat there is a fixed amount of mass. Then talk about the constant volume heat capacity and constant pressure heat capacity. Then talk about the latent heat which means heat required to change the phase of any system, then that type of heat requirement is known as a latent heat. There is a difference between sensible heat and latent heat. Latent heat is required to change the phase at constant temperature, where in sensible heat temperature will change but there is no change in phase. So talk about the difference between latent heat and sensible heat. Then talk about the exothermic reaction, a reaction which release heat from system to surrounding, then that type of reaction is known as a exothermic reaction. Then talk about the endothermic reaction, a reaction which require heat from surrounding to form product, then that type of reaction is known as a endothermic reaction. And then talk about basic difference between endothermic reaction and exothermic reaction. So I am completing my lecture here. Thank you.